Hi, today we're going to talk about an American artist by the name of Mark Tobey. He was born in Wisconsin in the year 1890, but he moved to Seattle when he was 3 years old. He lived there for quite a while, and eventually he moved to New York, and he was an interior designer. And then he moved to Chicago and he continued to do interior design there as well. And he did that for about 7 years. So um, he started to kind of learn a little bit more about art. And eventually, as he was practicing his art, he met a Chinese student from the University of Washington after he had moved back to Seattle. And he taught him how to do the ancient art of Chinese calligraphy. And that really inspired a lot of Mark Tobey's work for the rest of his life. He moved a lot. A lot of it had to do with what was going on in the world at that time. So like I said, he started in Wisconsin, he moved to Seattle, then he went to New York, then Chicago, then back to Seattle. Eventually he moved to England, where he stayed for quite a while, and he was there from about 1930 till 1937. He painted this painting behind me, and it's titled Broadway. He painted that in 1935 when he was living in England. Then eventually he moved back to Seattle. He traveled quite a bit throughout Europe, and he ended his life in the year 1976 living in Switzerland. So he lived throughout Europe and spent a good chunk of time in some of the major cities here in the US and some time in Seattle. So he was obviously fascinated by the idea of calligraphy, and it started to kind of morph his paintings, and they started to change. Broadway is one of the it's one of his more popular paintings that people point out as like a transition of when things were kind of changing for him and the style of his artwork changing. So his artwork initially would have been a little bit more realistic. You can see here in the painting behind me, this is Broadway. So this is supposed to be in New York City, and you can kind of make the outline of, you can definitely see people at the bottom, like on the streets, and you can see cars, and you can tell that this is a street, so it's Broadway. So you can see that, and you can see the different buildings, and you can kind of see some of the artwork. And this is kind of like shaped, kind of like a music, kind of like a clef almost. And so Broadway is famous in New York for where a lot of like entertainment is, like specifically musicals or shows will be on Broadway. And that's just a huge part of New York culture, is the Broadway aspect of it. And so that would have been kind of a glitzy and glamour and very busy, especially at nighttime. And so you can see a lot of that going into this. And now as his work progresses, he uses a lot of these same techniques. This right here with all of the white, it's called white writing. And he was directly inspired by calligraphy to create this technique. And it became even more prominent in his artwork as he continued to get older and older. And his paintings became more and more abstract. It's pretty easy to tell looking at this, if you just are paying attention for more than a few seconds, that there's people and a road and buildings. But as his art progresses throughout his life, it will become less literal and a lot more abstract. And you can kind of find bits and pieces of things that you might recognize throughout his artwork, but you won't necessarily be able to like make an overall storyline about his artwork. So he was, some of his like more remarkable things that he did in his career, he was the first American artist to be featured in the Louvre in Paris, which is the most famous museum in Paris, France. And so that was a pretty big deal for him. He was able to do a lot of work for the federal government in like the 1930s, and this was kind of a way that the government was helping during the Great Depression. So this largely affected where he lived and what he did for a living. So when I said he lived in England between 1930 and 1937, he specifically had a teaching position where he was teaching other students about artwork. And he of course was painting, because he painted this during that time period, during his own time. But this was during the Great Depression, and so it was kind of hard to find work, especially as an artist, because some people would still buy your art, but when the Great Depression was happening and people were barely able to make ends meet, they couldn't buy food, they didn't have a place to live, affording artwork was going to be a lot difficult for families. And so the federal government created a program where artists would create flyers and murals and artwork for the government. And so he participated in that, and that was one way he made money. But he also had to take a teaching position. In 1937, that was pretty close to when World War II was starting, and that heavily influenced his decision to move back to the States. But he did continue to have relationships with the art world in Europe, and he actually seemed to be a little bit more popular in Europe than he ever was in America throughout his lifetime, and obviously was a lot more involved with art in Europe after World War II, especially because we know that he moved back and he died in Switzerland later in his life. So he was a really interesting artist who was a pioneer for his time by creating this technique that they called white writing. And like I said, he started with more realistic paintings at the beginning of his career, and he went a lot more abstract at the end with things that were a little bit less noticeable, but still in the same style, and you could tell that it was from the same artist. So I really hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit about Mark Tobey today, and I'm excited to see you guys next time. Thanks. Bye.